Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight. July 14th is recognized around the world as International Non-Binary Day. It's an occasion to shine a light on those who identify as non-binary and celebrate the rich diversity of the community. Non-binary describes someone who does not identify exclusively as a man or woman. They may identify as both or completely outside of these categories. Tonight we open up this space to talk about their lived experiences, raise awareness, and educate the community about this subject. Kicking off our conversation tonight are Nick Arteaga and B. Nanase Barbera, two local non-binary people. And thank you both so much for being here tonight. It's a pleasure to have you both.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
I'd like to start our conversation by talking about some terms, some common vocabulary, just so people can get on the same page as us. What does cisgender mean, transgender and non-binary?
I think you already told us what non-binary means, so we can kind of skip over that and if B wants to touch more on it. But cisgender would be somebody who feels aligned with the sex assigned at birth. So that if they were assigned female at birth and they feel like they're a woman and they've never had any incongruency with their gender identity, they would be considered cisgender. And then transgender, I see it as an umbrella term, which would encompass anybody who doesn't feel cisgender. So there's a lot of folks that would fall under that umbrella.
For sure. I will say that some non-binary people, actually a lot of non-binary people, don't necessarily identify as trans. I do, however, and that's a very personal thing. And I think there's an interesting thing about how the terminologies within our own communities are so varied. So we need to be sensitive to like individual experiences despite having these vocabularies.
And I'm glad that you all touched on that and made that a point, because some people do sort of get confused, and that's what we're here to do tonight, is to educate and help people understand this subject more.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the history of non-binary people. What can you tell us about that?
So there are examples of non-binary people all throughout history. There's the Mahu people of Hawaii, there is the Hijra people of India, and we see third gender people in indigenous cultures all the time. Some people call them two-spirit. They have individual names depending on tribes and languages. But we see that this is a common occurrence throughout the world. But modern history of non-binary people in America probably starts with the fact that a lot of people who are older than me and Nick don't necessarily use the word non-binary to identify that way, even though they might be gender non-conforming and don't necessarily align themselves with traditional cisgender like identities.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's so interesting as we piece together history and we read up about this, we realize this was just another form of calling someone who identifies as non-binary. It was just a different term, and now we actually have something to call this identity. Do we have any statistics or data on non-binary people in Utah?
So not in Utah particularly, but there was a national study recently released by the Williams Institute. So they recently found out that there's approximately 1.2 million non-binary adults in America. That's a huge number of people. And a lot of people think that they don't know non-binary people or that it's a rare occurrence. But think about that number, 1.2 million adults who feel that way, who are that way. Like, that's such a huge number.
That's a lot of people. That's 1/3 of the population in Utah, if we were to just scale it down in that way.
Thank you.
I was going to say it's about 1 in 4, because I read a similar study, or maybe the same one, but that statistic stood out to me. But you're right, if we generalize it for this population in this state, it would be 1 in 3.
Right. Nick, gender is a spectrum, but how do you explain that and help someone understand who may not know as much about that concept?
Yeah, so just for visualization, I imagine the binary genders, like female and male, woman, man, to be more linear, for example. So that's how people generally see gender, like you're one or the other. I just kind of envision it as a big circle or glob, and you can land anywhere in that space and it's all valid. But a lot of folks, I think, have been taught that there's only two, and there's a lot that perpetuates that misinformation. So we're just here to do what we can to try and educate people in a kind and compassionate way, because I had that same narrative for a really long time, so I can empathize with that.
Definitely. Even though I am a non-binary person, I didn't even understand my identity, and I definitely had negative thoughts and biases against this. I was like, oh, this isn't real. And then as I got older, I realized oh, I'm one of those people. Yeah. It happens.
Right. One topic that I would like to talk about is pronouns. Now, because we have both of you on the same segment, we couldn't fit your pronouns on your name banner. Can you tell us what your pronouns are, and what are some pronouns that non-binary folks use?
I'll go first just because B has a really good elaboration on that. So mine are he, him, and they, them. So I appreciate my masculine, like, red privileges. It's something that I always thought that I wanted, that who I was, and now I've realized I'm a little bit more just kind of floating around that spectrum. So I also use they, them pronouns just to kind of destigmatize the use of non-binary pronouns, but it also fits better than he and him do all the time.
What about you, B?
So I use they, them, and fair pronouns. So I know they, them is a very common pronoun associated with non-binary identities, and I'm really comfortable with that. Fair is a set of neo-pronouns. So neo means new. So these are pronouns that are not associated with like the three he, she, they, which is, by the way, all three of those pronouns can be used by non-binary people because pronouns aren't actually associated with your gender. Even cisgendered people can use, for instance, if you felt comfortable with he, you could use that, Rosie, or they, or whatever you wanted. Like, it's not really an issue about that. So also there's other pronouns such as Theythem or Theyzer. And you can actually look up neo-pronouns or list of pronouns and you'll find out there's a long, rich history in just the English language alone. Like 700 years of singular they. So like, we really need to understand that like we've been using this language and these people have been here the entire time.
Right, and I think it's important to note that you cannot just assume what someone's pronouns are just by looking at them. Nick and B, unfortunately we have to wrap, but real quick, tell us about some online resources that cisgender allies can go to be better supportive of their non-binary friends and community members.
Absolutely. The Utah Pride Center has a lot of great resources. Equality Utah, we have the Trevor Project, we have the LGBTQ Resource Center up at the U, the Transgender Health Program up at the U. Any more you want to add?
I would recommend reaching out on online Facebook groups. Look at like LGBTQ, insert your community here or insert your county. Check out your local P flag. Associate with other people who have non-binary children if you have one. Like, be part of it. Like.
Thank you so much, and we'll post more of these resources online in this segment at abc4.com/infocus. You've been hearing from Nick Arteaga and B. Nanase Barbera, two local non-binary people. Nick and B, thank you so much for being here to share your personal lived experience and being a part of this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us once again, Rosie.
We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on International Non-Binary Day. Up next in our discussion is Christopher Malin. They are the co-chair of the Transgender Education Advocates of Utah. Christopher, we appreciate you so much for making time to be here tonight. Let's start with understanding more about what it means to be non-binary. How do you define being non-binary? Does being non-binary mean being non-conforming by nature?
Thank you, Rosie, for having me. So how we've already kind of went over how non-binary is kind of defined to a sense. So I like to define non-binary by how I see it a little bit more, since we kind of already have a little bit of touch on this. So non-binary to me means just being fully authentic, for being able to be the gender identity and gender expression that you want to be. So for me, how to outline this a little bit better would be, for me, assigned at birth, I was assigned male. My gender identity, how I see myself, is female. I almost always express myself or see myself internally as female. And then my gender expression, I like to express myself in a non-binary way, because I feel like it's authentic and respectful to the way how I'm seen, as well as the way I feel. And so in doing so, I'm kind of a blend, depending on how I feel that day. But non-conforming is a term we've used a lot in the non-binary community. And I feel like it can be a little misleading. I think a lot of times people feel like non-conforming means that you don't want to be part of society, or that you don't want to be into the positive change. Well, I think that's a total misnomer. I think being non-conforming just means you don't want to be conforming to the gender stereotypes that may hold you back. For instance, when I came out at work about 8 years ago, I came out as transgender because I identify as transgender as well as non-binary, and I like using the term non-conforming trans. And my coworker, or my manager at the time, sat me down and said, let's not use that term because I feel like that, people will take that as that you don't want to be part of the team. And I think that people need to not see it that way. We're trying to build a safe, inclusive space for all. This is really to take away the restrictions of the binary and making it so that individuals can just be themselves so they can be a better part of society. So we're not trying to take anything away from the binary. We want the binary, LGBT, everybody to feel like they can just be themselves and to let us know how they want to be seen.
Thank you so much for sharing that. What are some similarities within bisexual culture and non-binary culture, and how can one help the other progress?
I actually really like this question because I actually identify as both. Technically, I identify more as pansexual than bisexual, but I feel like historically we've had a lot of pushback from society. So bisexual culture has always heard kind of terms of like, hey, this is just a phase, or like, pick a side. I grew up in the 90s really remembering what it felt like to be bisexual and feeling like I was kind of swept under the rug and kind of hidden. And recently coming around as the second phase of more of a spectrum way of looking at life, we're seeing kind of non-binary culture. And I think this is another way where people are being a lot more visible with gender expression is seen a lot more. And it's giving the opportunity for there to be more of a talk about multiple talks of like sexuality and gender being more on the spectrum. So when we hear terms like, hey, binary or non-binary culture is just this thing that, younger individuals do, and that, if you just conformed and, looked a little bit more one way or the other, people would like you a little bit more. I think the reality is that we as non-binary individuals, lost my train of thought, sorry. When we progress as non-binary culture, we're actually supporting the whole LGBT culture as a whole, because we're expressing that there is more of an option of being more fluid, if that makes sense.
Yes, that does. Thank you, Christopher. How often is non-binary language missing in policy, and how does that make things sometimes confusing for non-binary folks?
Yeah, so actually this is one of my favorite topics working for Transgender Education Advocates of Utah. I work a lot with making inclusive policies for coming out transgender in the workplace. And a lot of times we see terminology using trans terminology. So saying what your rights are in the umbrella term of trans, even though this includes by Title VII gender identity and gender expression. And even though we know that we have rights here, we don't always know that other people are educated in our rights. And so we don't know if we're going to get pushback. We don't know if we're going to be hurt in trying to access these rights. And to be honest, sometimes we are learning still to be our own advocates, and we don't always know our rights fully. So changing these policies to use more, so more specific terminology, we're less likely to misunderstand the situation causing stress on a non-binary individual.
Thank you so much, Christopher. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but it's been so great to have you here and hear you speak about these issues and helping us learn more about this subject. Folks, you've been hearing from Christopher Malin. They are the co-chair of the Transgender Education Advocates of Utah. Christopher, it was great to hear from you tonight. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you for having me, Rosie.
We'll be right back. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on International Non-Binary Day. Rounding out our conversation tonight is M, who is a local non-binary person. M, thank you so much for being here tonight. This is your second day here. We had you on Good Things Utah yesterday for a science experiment, but we're excited to have you here for something a little bit more personal and close to your heart.
Thanks so much, Rosie.
No problem. Now, your partner, Kat Palmer, who unfortunately couldn't join us here tonight, she is the mother of a local binary child.
Yes.
And that is something that can be a little foreign to navigate.
Yes.
Do you have some tips on how parents can be supportive and inclusive of their child when their child comes up to them and say, hey mom, hey dad, I'm non-binary?
Yes, definitely. It's really true that using the correct pronouns is suicide prevention. in a state where suicide is prevalent, we need to do more than just love our kids. We need to accept and respect their preferred pronouns. So if you're a parent of a non-binary child, I think it's really important to show that you care about their preferred pronouns and make a real effort to use the preferred pronouns. And also just to be a good role model and to respect how people want to show up in the world and to let them know it's okay to exist in however they want to exist on the gender spectrum.
And I want to emphasize this is also important for teachers to do as well for their students at school, right?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. Any significant adult in a child's life, you know, needs to know that they're accepted by that adult. So, like for example, teachers maybe could move away from saying boys and girls, which implies, you know, a gender binary society, and we know we have this third gender, and so using language like just children or students, friends,
team, right?
Exactly, would be very helpful.
What would you say to people who are reluctant to use they, them pronouns because they believe that it's not proper English?
Yeah, I get that people may not be accustomed to using they, them as pronouns for a single individual. So it can be a little bit maybe foreign or they're not familiar with it. But Webster Dictionary actually, it's part of the definition of they, them. You can look it up, and I did actually, if you don't mind if I read it.
Not at all, please.
It says, quote, used to refer to a single person whose gender identity is non-binary. That's actually language in the dictionary, and they actually have a link to the word non-binary, and so you can go and see there is a definition for non-binary that's related to gender.
So that's as official as it gets, I would say.
Yeah, and I just want to say one other thing about this is that, you know, our language is always evolving.
Very true.
Exactly, to fit the way that our society is evolving. So this is really a reflection of what society sees, you know, and the society in general is recognizing there's this third gender category.
Thank you for that. Now, you've been approached in the bathroom before, which is a big no-no. Can you share a little bit about how that impacted you and why it's not okay to do that to someone who may be non-binary?
Yeah, this is a sticky subject, but I use the women's restroom when I'm in public if there's not a gender neutral option for me. And you know, I present as more masculine, so sometimes I do get weird looks from people in those spaces, and you know, it makes me feel bad about myself, and it makes me feel like I don't belong, that I'm an outcast. And you know, ultimately I think we all just want the same thing. We all just want to feel safe when we need to take care of our bodily functions.
Right.
And so I would just ask people to maybe be aware of that. Again, it's being aware that there's this third gender category that a lot of people exist in, and sharing their spaces with those people while we sort of wait for society to catch up, wait for business entities to install gender neutral bathrooms, because there's no other option for me.
Right. Touching off your last answer, what can businesses and employers do to be more inclusive and show visibility to non-binary folks?
Well, the bathroom certainly is one area. Moving away from, if you have a single-use bathroom, just label it as gender neutral. That would be one really sort of easy thing that you could do. I'll also maybe throw in the placards or the signs that have the female-male images. Those are also not inclusive because I don't identify as either female or male. So kind of if you have that placard, just getting rid of it and just saying gender neutral, or just say bathroom.
A smiley face.
Yeah, exactly. Something else. That's one thing. Also, on their like intake forms, they can include the third gender category. So that's always kind of difficult when you're filling out those intake forms. You know, if I have to select one gender that I don't identify with.
Really great
Yeah.
tips there. And we have about 30 seconds left. What would you like to leave our viewers with tonight?
I think just what I said before, just being aware that there is this third gender category, and being sensitive to that. A lot of people exist in that gender category, and just trying the best you can to use they, them pronouns, or being sensitive, using or maybe avoid language like ladies and gentlemen, avoiding titles like sir and ma'am, maybe not assuming a gender, assuming my gender by looking at me the way that I present with my fashion style or hairstyle or whatever, and not calling me lady, for example. But when addressing someone, just say welcome or hello, and not putting a gender to that.
And that is something we can all think about. Food for thought there, and it's something we can all work on. Thank you so much, Em.
Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
All right, and remember, we invite you to join our Facebook group online. It's facebook.com/group/ABC4InFocus, or you can send us an email at infocus@abc4.com. We'll be right back.